Welcome to Lore of the Lost, where we uncover stories from the past steeped in truth and historical accuracy. Get unheard of perspectives and discover what life was really like during these times. Listen to the boring history as you drift off into another world. I am George Lancaster, your speaker tonight, and please let me hear where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments. Now listen along as we adventure into the shadows of the Second World War, where precision and patience became matters of life and death. The morning mist clung to the hills outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, as Private First Class Thomas Mitchell adjusted his grip on the Springfield rifle. The year was 1943, and the war had already been raging for nearly 2 years before America joined the fight. This changed when a sniper program was initiated at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, at the end of 1942. Thomas had been selected from his infantry unit not for any particular heroism, but for something far more mundane. He could shoot straight. Back home in rural Montana, he'd grown up hunting elk and deer across vast mountain ranges, learning to read wind patterns and judge distances by instinct rather than calculation. The selection process had been surprisingly informal. Drawn from hunters, competitive shooters, natural marksmen, outdoorsmen, city dwellers, farmers, and veteran soldiers, they fought to assert local battlefield dominance and instill among their enemy a paralyzing fear. Thomas remembered the day his company commander had called him aside after rifle practice. No fanfare, no special ceremony, just a simple question about whether he'd ever shot at distances beyond 300 yards. When Thomas mentioned the 800-yard shot he'd made on a bull elk 3 seasons prior, the captain had simply nodded and told him to report to a different barracks the following morning. Although the U.S. Army set up an advanced marksmanship course at Camp Perry, Ohio, the Army had no official sniper course during World War II. What Thomas found himself part of was something hastily assembled, born of necessity rather than doctrine. At the outbreak of the war, the U.S. Army was even less prepared for sniping than the British, and despite the obvious success of snipers against them in both the European and Pacific theaters, senior American commanders never adopted a systematic program of sniper training. Although having access to many outstanding marksmen, this lack of commitment meant that results were haphazard indeed. The training began before dawn each day. Thomas would wake to the sound of rain drumming against the wooden barracks roof, the North Carolina humidity already making his uniform stick to his skin. The other men in his makeshift sniper course came from backgrounds as varied as America itself. A factory worker from Detroit who'd won shooting competitions at company picnics, a farm boy from Iowa who could pick off crows at impossible distances, even a former police officer from New York who understood the weight of taking a life through a scope. The chief weakness in U.S. training methods was the gap between marksmanship, which was of a very high standard, and fieldcraft, which tended to be less thorough. When some ad hoc schools were set up behind the lines, they tended to deal with handling the telescopic-sighted rifle rather than the tactical intricacies of the World War II sniper's art. Thomas learned this firsthand as he spent hours on the rifle range, perfecting his shooting technique with the modified Springfield rifle that would become his constant companion. The rifle itself was a marvel of American engineering, adapted for a specific purpose. On January 18, 1943, Remington Arms received a contract to take 20,000 M1903A3 Springfield rifles from the production line and convert them to the M1903A4. The M1903A3 was modified by turning down the bolt handle for scope clearance, removing all iron sights, fitting permanent scope blocks, and installing a 2.2 by power weaver scope designated M73B1. Thomas spent countless hours learning every component of his weapon: how to adjust the scope for different distances, how to account for wind drift, how the rifle would behave in different weather conditions. The scope itself was a window into a different kind of warfare. British and Soviet scopes were 3.5x, and the US and Japan favored 2.5x. Surviving snipers tell of more 200 to 300 yard shots than any at longer ranges. Through that modest magnification, Thomas learned to see the battlefield differently than his fellow infantry soldiers. Where they saw general movement and muzzle flashes, he learned to identify specific targets, an officer's insignia, the telltale glint of binoculars, the distinctive silhouette of an enemy sniper. The daily routine was methodical, almost meditative in its precision. Thomas would wake at 0500 hours, clean his rifle, and consume a breakfast of reconstituted eggs and black coffee that tasted like burnt wood. The morning would be spent on the range, practicing shots at various distances, while instructors observed every aspect of his technique: his breathing, his trigger pull, the way he settled into his shooting position. A sniper will enter information into a data on previous engagement dope book, such as lot number, temperature, wind speed, direction, humidity, and altitude. If the same conditions are encountered again, the data is available to assist in making an accurate shot. Thomas kept meticulous records in his small leather-bound notebook. Each shot was documented: the weather conditions, the distance, the ammunition lot number, even his own physical condition. He learned that a shot fired on a humid morning would behave differently than one fired in the dry heat of afternoon. The rifle would shoot slightly high when the barrel was cold, and the scope's reticle would appear to shift subtly as the metal expanded and contracted with temperature changes. The hours spent studying his data book became as important as the time on the firing range. Thomas would pore over his entries by lamplight in the barracks, looking for patterns that might give him an edge in combat. He noticed that his accuracy improved marginally when he'd had a full night's sleep, that certain lot numbers of ammunition consistently grouped tighter than others, and that his natural point of aim shifted slightly depending on how much equipment he carried. These small observations, seemingly insignificant in training, would prove invaluable when every shot might mean the difference between mission success and failure. The instructors began incorporating more complex scenarios into the training regimen as Thomas progressed. Rather than simply shooting at stationary targets on a known distance range, he found himself stalking through mock villages constructed behind the firing line, identifying targets among mannequins dressed as civilians. The ethical dimension of precision shooting became increasingly apparent. In conventional warfare, soldiers fired at massed formations or general positions, but snipers had to make split-second decisions about individual human beings seen clearly through magnified optics. Night training sessions added another layer of complexity to Thomas's education. Using starlight and moonlight to navigate unfamiliar terrain, he learned to move silently through darkness, to establish shooting positions without making noise that might alert enemy sentries. The instructors taught him to use natural illumination to his advantage, how the faint outline of a target might be visible against a slightly lighter background, how to position himself so that enemy muzzle flashes would reveal positions without compromising his own concealment. These nocturnal exercises left Thomas exhausted, but increasingly confident in abilities he'd never imagined possessing. Weather training proved equally demanding as the instructors exposed the sniper candidates to every condition North Carolina could provide. Thomas learned to shoot in driving rain that obscured his scope lens, in wind that required increasingly complex calculations for bullet drift, and in the oppressive heat that made metal components too hot to touch comfortably. Each weather condition demanded adjustments not only to his shooting technique, but to his equipment maintenance routine. Scopes fogged in humidity, metal parts corroded in salt air, and ammunition could be affected by temperature extremes. The camaraderie among the sniper candidates developed slowly, built on shared hardships and mutual respect for the skills each man brought to the program. Thomas found himself drawn to conversations with men whose backgrounds couldn't have been more different from his own. City boys who had never seen a deer, farm hands who had never fired at anything smaller than a barn door, competition shooters who understood precision but had never had to worry about someone shooting back. These late-night discussions in the barracks revealed the complex motivations that had brought each man to this specialized training. Some sought the technical challenge, others the opportunity to serve in a unique capacity, and a few simply wanted to survive the war with skills that might give them an edge. The psychological evaluation process, conducted by Army psychiatrists who had studied the mental requirements of precision shooting, added another dimension to Thomas's preparation. The doctors were interested not just in his ability to kill at distance, but in his capacity to maintain emotional stability while doing so repeatedly. They administered tests designed to measure his reaction to stress, his ability to compartmentalize disturbing experiences, and his likelihood of developing what they termed scope shock, a condition where snipers became paralyzed by the intimate nature of their kills. Thomas learned that some of the most skilled marksmen had washed out of sniper programs not due to poor shooting, but because they couldn't psychologically handle the responsibility of deliberate individual killing. Equipment modification became a constant process as Thomas learned to adapt his gear for maximum effectiveness. The standard issue equipment was only a starting point. Each sniper developed personal preferences and modifications based on his individual needs and the specific requirements of his intended theater of operations. Thomas learned to wrap his rifle sling with cloth to prevent it from catching on vegetation, to modify his scope lens covers for quicker deployment, and to arrange his ammunition pouches for silent access. These seemingly minor adjustments represented the difference between a successful mission and one that ended in discovery and death. The study of enemy tactics intensified as intelligence reports filtered back from active combat zones. Thomas pored over captured Japanese training manuals that had been translated and distributed to American sniper schools. These documents revealed an approach to sniping that was both similar to and radically different from American methods. Japanese snipers were trained to accept death as an inevitable consequence of their missions, to tie themselves into positions from which they never expected to retreat. This philosophy of expendable precision created tactical challenges that American snipers would need to understand and counter. Map reading and terrain analysis became crucial components of Thomas's education. Using topographical maps of various Pacific islands, he learned to identify likely sniper positions, approach routes, and fields of fire before ever seeing the actual terrain. The instructors taught him to think like his enemy. Where would a Japanese sniper position himself on this ridge? What natural features would provide the best concealment? How would weather and tide conditions affect visibility and shooting conditions? This intellectual approach to battlefield preparation would prove essential when time and circumstances didn't permit detailed reconnaissance. Physical conditioning took on new importance as Thomas prepared for the rigors of jungle warfare. The North Carolina heat was nothing compared to the tropical conditions he would face in the Pacific, but the instructors used every available method to prepare their students for the physical demands of combat. Thomas learned to maintain shooting accuracy while dehydrated, to control his breathing after physical exertion, and to function effectively despite the constant presence of insects, humidity, and oppressive heat. The physical stress of these exercises was compounded by the weight of equipment. A combat-loaded sniper carried significantly more gear than a standard infantryman. Medical training formed an essential part of sniper preparation, as these soldiers would often operate in small teams far from immediate medical support. Thomas learned to treat bullet wounds, to manage shock, and to perform basic field surgery on himself or his spotter. This training took on particular urgency given the Japanese practice of targeting wounded soldiers and medical personnel. A wounded sniper team couldn't simply call for a medic. They had to be prepared to treat themselves and continue their mission, or successfully extract to friendly lines. Communication procedures and equipment became increasingly important as Thomas learned about the coordination required for effective sniper operations. He was trained on various radio sets, learned to use field telephones, and mastered the complex procedures for calling in artillery or air support. The intelligence value of sniper teams meant they needed reliable methods to transmit information back to their units, often while maintaining concealment and operating behind enemy lines. Thomas practiced encoding and transmitting position reports, target information, and requests for support, using methods that would be secure even if intercepted. The final psychological preparation involved what the instructors termed ethical conditioning, helping the sniper candidates understand and accept the moral dimensions of their role. Unlike infantry soldiers who fired at masses of enemy troops in the chaos of battle, snipers would see their targets clearly, would study them through scopes, and would make deliberate decisions to end individual lives. The instructors, drawing on early reports from combat zones, explained that this intimacy could create psychological problems that didn't affect other soldiers. Thomas learned techniques for emotional compartmentalization, for maintaining focus on military objectives rather than personal cost, and for processing the psychological aftermath of successful missions. Live-fire exercises against moving targets marked the culmination of Thomas's marksmanship training. Using remote-controlled sleds that pulled silhouette targets across the range at various speeds and distances, he learned to lead moving targets, to time his shots for maximum effect, and to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. These exercises required split-second decision-making and precise shooting under time pressure, skills that would be essential when enemy soldiers appeared in his scope for only brief moments. The instructors emphasized that in combat, targets of opportunity would rarely remain stationary long enough for lengthy preparation and careful aiming. The fieldcraft training was where Thomas truly began to understand the nature of his new role. Snipers were also highly trained in fieldcraft and would be skilled at moving across country undetected. With a good position and able to put the range of their rifles to good use, snipers could dominate the ground around them. He learned to move through forests without disturbing the natural patterns of leaves and branches, to recognize the subtle differences between natural shadows and those that might conceal an enemy position. The instructors, many of whom were veterans of the First War or had studied European tactics, emphasized patience above all else. Thomas learned to lie motionless for hours, observing a particular area through his scope, waiting for targets that might never appear. His body would cramp, his eyes would water from the strain of maintaining focus. But he learned to endure these discomforts as part of the job. Snipers employ camouflage and limit their movements in order to avoid detection. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the training. Snipers were taught to recognize enemy badges of rank and would prioritize as targets enemy officers and also specialist troops. Thomas learned to identify different uniform markings to distinguish between regular soldiers and high-value targets. The instructors were frank about the nature of the work. This wasn't the anonymous killing of conventional warfare, where enemy soldiers were distant figures in the chaos of battle. Through a scope, Thomas would see faces, individual human beings who would die by his deliberate action. The weight of this responsibility settled over Thomas gradually, like dust accumulating on furniture. During quiet moments in the barracks, he would clean his rifle and think about the letters from home, about his younger sister's descriptions of the victory gardens and rationing, about his father's work in the copper mines that supported the war effort. The disconnect between that familiar world and his current reality was profound. Back home, people spoke of the war in terms of grand strategy and national purpose, but Thomas was learning to think in terms of individual targets and precise shots. But although there's a certain amount of glamour attached to the skill involved in sniping, snipers weren't always popular. Their shots from the front line could draw enemy mortar or machine gun retaliation. And many soldiers instinctively disliked what snipers represented, the chance of being killed without warning. Thomas began to understand that he was training for a role that would isolate him not only from the enemy, but in some ways from his own comrades. The physical demands of the training were relentless. Thomas learned to carry his rifle and equipment across miles of rough terrain, to establish shooting positions in locations that offered both concealment and clear fields of fire. His hands developed calluses from countless hours of practice, and his shoulder bore a permanent bruise from the rifle's recoil. Snipers may also use monopods, bipods, or tripods to steady their aim. He practiced shooting from various positions, prone, sitting, kneeling, and learned to use natural features like rocks or fallen logs as improvised shooting rests. The ammunition itself became a subject of intense study. Ideally, a shooter would acquire rounds from a single lot or batch of manufactured ammunition, zero the rifle to that lot, and then use only that ammunition until it runs out. This ensures that every bullet is as similar as possible to the previous one and assists consistency. Thomas learned to examine each cartridge before loading it, looking for subtle differences in the brass casing or variations in the bullet seating that might affect accuracy. In combat, such attention to detail could mean the difference between a successful mission and a missed opportunity that might not come again. As weeks turned to months, Thomas began to develop the peculiar skills that would define his wartime service. He learned to read the landscape like a book, identifying likely enemy positions and approach routes. His eyes became trained to spot the unnatural, a straight line in a world of curves, a shadow that fell the wrong way, movement that didn't match the rhythm of wind-blown vegetation. Special care has to be taken with the telescopic sight because the front lens cannot be fully covered and is made of a highly reflective surface, normally polished glass, off which the glare of the sun can easily reflect. The technical aspects of his equipment became second nature. Thomas could disassemble and reassemble his rifle in complete darkness, could adjust his scope for different ranges without conscious thought. He learned the ballistic characteristics of his ammunition so thoroughly that he could estimate bullet drop and wind drift by instinct. Measures are also taken to ensure the rifle is affected as little as possible by heating, vibration, and other effects, which may reduce accuracy. The daily routine at Fort Bragg began to prepare Thomas for the realities he would face overseas. The business of the World War II sniper developed into a refined practice of killing and gathering intelligence in Europe and the South Pacific. He learned that his role would extend beyond simply eliminating enemy personnel. He would serve as the eyes and ears of his unit, gathering intelligence about enemy movements, positions, and capabilities. The intelligence-gathering aspect of sniper work fascinated Thomas. Through his scope, he would observe enemy positions for hours, noting patterns of activity, identifying key personnel, and reporting back to his commanders. They often also serve as scouts, observers, feeding tactical information back to their units or command headquarters. This required a different kind of patience than marksmanship, the ability to watch without acting, to gather information that others would use to make tactical decisions. As his training progressed, Thomas began to understand the broader context of his role in the war. During World War II, 25,000 bullets were needed by the average infantry soldier to kill one enemy combatant. The number for a well-trained sniper, 1.3 bullets. The efficiency of sniper operations represented a significant advantage in a war where resources were precious and every advantage counted. The psychological preparation for combat intensified as Thomas neared the completion of his training. The instructors shared stories from the European theater where American snipers were already engaged against German forces. Upon arrival in Tunisia, Colonel Sidney Hines of the 41st Armored Infantry Regiment created a training course that lasted 5 weeks and graduated a number of snipers. Elsewhere, if commanders took no interest, nothing would be done. Thomas learned that his effectiveness would depend not only on his individual skills, but on the support and understanding of his commanding officers. The final weeks of training focused on the harsh realities Thomas would face in combat. The instructors, drawing from reports from the front lines, described the different challenges of fighting in various theaters. In fact, the casualty rate was nearly 5 times higher in the Pacific than it was in Europe. Thomas learned about the unique challenges of jungle warfare, where visibility was limited and enemy snipers were masters of camouflage. The Japanese were masters of camouflage, and since most of the fighting in Asia and the Pacific was at relatively short range, emphasis was placed on camouflage and fieldcraft. Each sniper was issued camouflage nets for helmet and body, although simpler methods were more common in the field. Thomas studied photographs and intelligence reports describing Japanese sniper tactics, learning about their use of trees and their extraordinary patience. Japanese snipers were known for their patience and ability to remain hidden for long periods, almost never leaving their carefully camouflaged sniping spots. This meant that whenever a sniper was in the area, the location of the sniper could sometimes only be determined after the sniper had fired a few shots. The equipment Thomas would carry into combat was carefully selected and maintained. Beyond his rifle and scope, he carried a rangefinder, binoculars, and various tools for maintaining his weapon in field conditions. The major components of sniper equipment are the precision sniper rifle, various optical scopes and field glasses, specialized ammunition and camouflage materials for the sniper's body and equipment. A sniper's spotter typically also wears camouflage. His uniform was modified with additional pockets for ammunition and equipment, and he learned to pack his gear in ways that minimized noise and bulk. The relationship between Thomas and his assigned spotter, Corporal Jake Morrison, became one of the most important aspects of his preparation. Morrison, a veteran of the North African campaign, brought practical experience that complemented Thomas's marksmanship skills. Military snipers from the US, UK, and other countries that adopt their military doctrine are typically deployed in two-man sniper teams consisting of a shooter and a spotter. A common practice is for a shooter and a spotter to take turns to avoid eye fatigue. Morrison taught Thomas the practical realities of combat that no training manual could convey. He described the weight of equipment during long marches, the challenge of maintaining weapons in tropical humidity, and the psychological strain of operating behind enemy lines. Morrison's stories of the African desert painted a picture of warfare that was both more mundane and more terrifying than Thomas had imagined. Long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of intense action, where split-second decisions could determine survival. As Thomas's training neared completion, he began to understand the full scope of what lay ahead. Throughout the war, the Japanese sniper proved a constant trial to his enemies, from coral atolls in the Pacific Ocean to the forests of New Guinea. The reports from the Pacific Theater described a different kind of warfare than what was being fought in Europe, one characterized by dense jungle terrain. One noticeable difference was the use of trees, even the rigging of small chairs among the branches and fronds. Thomas learned about Japanese tactics that seemed almost impossible to counter. Snipers who would tie themselves into treetops and remain motionless for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Conversely, the Japanese army considered snipers expendable. They were to tie themselves into trees or other concealment and then inflict casualties on enemy troops until killed. The psychological warfare aspect of sniping became increasingly clear to Thomas as he prepared for deployment. The 1st Battalion, 163rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, was badly troubled by snipers during one encounter. The divisional historian wrote, "From a tree almost anywhere around our oval perimeter, a Jap sharpshooter could choose a Yank target who had to leave his water-soaked hole." Thomas understood that his role would be not only to eliminate specific targets, but to counter the psychological impact that enemy snipers had on American forces. The final phase of Thomas's training involved simulated combat scenarios that attempted to replicate the conditions he would face overseas. He practiced shooting in various weather conditions, learned to estimate ranges in different types of terrain, and developed the mental discipline necessary to remain calm under pressure. The instructors emphasized that combat would be nothing like the controlled conditions of the training range. There would be no spotting scopes, no range markers, and no second chances. Thomas's daily routine during these final weeks became a rehearsal for combat. He would wake before dawn, conduct weapon maintenance, consume a quick meal, and then spend the day in field exercises that pushed his physical and mental limits. Also, the modern mystique of long-range sniping didn't really apply in World War II. The scopes weren't powerful, and few, if any, of the rifles were actually capable of MOA accuracy. The reality of his equipment's limitations became clear. Most of his shots would be at relatively close range, requiring different skills than the long-distance shooting that captured the public imagination. The morning Thomas received his orders for overseas deployment, the North Carolina mist hung heavier than usual around the barracks. He had completed his training, but as he packed his few personal belongings alongside his military equipment, he understood that his real education was just beginning. The rifle that had become an extension of his body would now be tested under conditions no training could fully simulate. Sometimes admired and other times reviled by their own comrades because of the retaliation they drew, they were always too few in number. Their battlefield role, their victories and their defeats are retold here from neglected or forgotten sources. Thomas was about to join a small fraternity of soldiers whose work was essential but often misunderstood, whose skills were desperately needed but whose methods made others uncomfortable. As he boarded the transport that would take him to the Pacific Theater, Thomas carried with him not just his rifle and equipment, but the accumulated knowledge of months of intensive training. He had learned to see the battlefield through a scope, to think in terms of windage and elevation, and to accept the weight of individual responsibility that came with every shot. The young man from Montana who had once hunted elk across mountain ranges was now prepared to hunt a very different kind of prey in the jungles and islands of the Pacific. The ship pulled away from the dock as Thomas stood at the rail, watching the American coastline disappear into the distance. Behind him lay the familiar world of training and preparation. Ahead lay the unknown realities of combat. He touched the rifle slung across his shoulder, feeling the weight of the weapon that would be his constant companion in the months to come. In these conditions, the World War II sniper could adapt these previously invaluable skills to produce an effective weapon. The war was waiting, and Thomas Mitchell, American sniper, was as ready as any man could be for what lay ahead. The good, the bad, and the ugly of his service would be written not in training manuals or official reports, but in the daily reality of combat, one carefully aimed shot at a time. This was the life of an American sniper in World War II. Not the romanticized version of popular imagination, but the methodical, dangerous, and psychologically demanding reality of precision warfare. Men like Thomas carried their skills and their burdens across the Pacific, where they would face an enemy equally skilled in the deadly art of sniping, in a conflict that would test every aspect of their training and character.